Hello, class. This is Jordan Krapke, Tucker Stout, and Michael Maxwell. And for our research project, our focus was on color packaging and if it affects consumers. This takes us into our initial hypothesis, which was we believe that different colors evoke different emotions depending on the product, and we believe certain colors coincide with certain products, which will cause consumers to choose that product based on that color. So based on this, we were planning to do an experiment that could isolate consumers' purchasing decisions on solely color. We wanted to know if there's a direct correlation between consumers' decisions and the color of the packaging. Our product design, therefore, not only had different colors of red, white, and blue, or red, blue, and green, but also different items to eliminate the factors of what the product was to the consumer. As I mentioned before, our sole focus was how color was to influence consumers' buying activity. We were planning to do it in the Cooper's Cafe or Cleveland's Business Center, and with the decision, the consumer or experimentee were to fill out a survey to demonstrate if they was any correlation to their decision of buying different products with different packaging colors. Unfortunately, like mostly everyone else in this group or everyone else in this class, we were unable to collect our own data, and we had to rely our project into one of just research. We set out on the task of finding experiments that could connect our working hypothesis. We knew that there wouldn't be a perfect match to what we were trying to test, but there is plenty of research in relationship to how color affects consumers. So for our first experiment we had to find importance and serious relationship to our topic was called the role of packaging in customers' buying behaviors. There are four different independent variables in the study, with those including packaging color, material, design of wrapper, and innovation. Of these independent variables, we obviously focused on color packaging. The dependent variable was consumer buying behavior. The study sampled 150 students who took the survey on a 1 to 5 scale. These volunteer students for each of these independent variables was presented with different packages. In the survey, 1 through 5, with 1 being the lowest effect on their likelihood to buy the product and 5 being the highest likelihood that the packaging influenced their purchase of the product. After completion of the test, results were given on a statistical R&P variable to show correlation between the independent variable of color of packaging and the dependent variable of the likelihood to buy the product. The results showed an R value of 0.589 and a P value of 0.000149, which demonstrated a positive correlation between buying behavior and packaging color. This experiment was talked about first because it had a very similar design to our initial experiment and a working hypothesis. The results of the experiment could be postulated that it may have shown very similar results with our own design and our own experiment. From here on out, most of these experiments test color and how it affects consumer behavior, but it is important to note that they introduce other variables as well to coincide with color packaging. In experiment 2, the impact of products packaging color on consumers' buying preferences with time pressure, it was tested. Before they tested, they noted that 60 to 90% of appraisal of all products by consumers is affected by color. Their hypothesis to test then was how time affects consumers, except how time affects consumers' acceptance or rejection of the color. This method of the study was one that was self-administered and was one of two parts. On a 5-point scale, where 1 meant less agreed on and 5 meant most agreed on, a survey was conducted with customers' buying preference to color. These surveys were given to different groups of people, one with a time constraint and one without. The results of the experiment indicated that a p-value was less than 0.05, a value of correlation coefficient with a p-value of 0.46. This demonstrated that the independent variable of color usage and the time pressure has a positive but moderate relationship with the dependent variable of consumers' buying behavior. So what does this mean? This means that in both cases, under time constraints and no time constraints, color played a significant role and effect on the purchasing behavior of consumers. Man, this was a long and detailed study, but it had a lot of information. In the third experiment, we felt we had value significance to our hypothesis and research because there was 128 people in the study with 5 different shopping trips. On the fourth shopping trip, they changed packaging and color of specific brands from common brands to well-known brands. Depending on brands is how the results panned out. It was an experiment that focused on color package manipulation, but it also looked to afflict how the brand of the product affects the consumers and their relationship to their initial reaction to the color. In common brands, and when I say common brands, I mean like store made brands like Kroger at a Kroger store. So these common brands, there wasn't a significant impact of consumers' buying behavior, but with the well known brands, there was a significant change in how consumers reacted to the fourth trip to the store and the color of the well known brands being changed to a different color. It led to a large decrease in the likelihood of consumers purchasing the well known brands. The results of this experiment obviously indicate that there is a reaction to manipulation of a packaging to the consumers, but especially with things that are familiar and established. We chose this experiment because, once again, it incorporated another variable while also applying to our initial design of manipulating color packaging of different products. And the charts on the screen help to show what this experiment was testing and the results of it. This was another detailed experiment. It was very long. The fourth experiment that we picked named the role of color on consumer behavior, and it was one that is highly reflective of our initial design. Instead of food products to test, to choose a focus of color, it chose shoe boxes alone, and the association between a person's likelihood to pick the shoebox first without even knowing the contents of what was inside the box. In one case of the test, they let the brand name or the box and tested it as an independent variable. And in the second, they removed the brand name and had it simply the color box. Orange was Nike, blue was Adidas, the brown was like a generic, whatever, whatever shoe brand. With 100% participants, they were taken through these 2 tests and given a survey for their likelihood to select the box, 1 being less likely and 3 being most likely. It was worth noting that in the second part of the experiment, the Nike box, not only with its color but without its logo, it may or may not contain the Nike shoes. So what does this mean and what are the results? The results demonstrated, like other experiments, that there's a 62 to 9% purchase decision on the color of packaging alone. On top of this, the experiment had a p-value of less than 0.05, which indicated between the independent variables of brand color and dependent variables that there was a moderately positive correlation between color on consumer while also shedding knowledge on a pre-existing cognition of colors may have an effect on consumers. To be honest, the results of this experiment are kind of confusing, and to me, it seems like further tests would need to be done with correlation coefficients and how they relate to the brand and the color of the box and how consumers knew. So I found that a little confusing. But however, it ties in with the previous experiment that we just talked about, and it also provides insight into how our original question with our initial design. As you remember, our initial working hypothesis discussed emotional influences with colors. So it was especially important to at least get one, or to find at least one to bring up this experiment of emotional states influencing color preferences. It wasn't an experiment that this one wasn't an experiment that specifically applied to consumers. It was more of a general study with how colors affect emotions. Yet it still has importance in its application to the consumer behavior field and how it relates to color packaging. The experiment, emotional state on consumer preferences, was simply that 197 students participated in the experiment for course credit. Experiments adopted a 2x3 mixed design, which meant that there was an emotional tone of color for happy or sad, the participants, and emotional, sad, neutral, and happy for the 3 part of it. The procedure of the experiment went like this, where students were asked to evaluate colors on a black to white scale on their emotional tones. Once they were finished with this, they were shown different videos on their computer, which were either inherently sad or inherently happy. Following this, they are asked to evaluate all the colors again on the black to white scale for their emotional tones of color. So the results, as shown on the bottom, the data shown that the statistical um, standpoint indicated that happiness from the videos increased, participants' preference for happy colors, and sadness increased preference for sad colors. It's very enlightening. It was overall an interesting study that easily could have been applied to the consumer field and the design of what we were testing in our original experiment. Our next two experiments are very similar, but they needed to both be included. Like how emotional states influence color preferences, masculinity and femininity concentration of colors have a significant impact into people's perception. 100 people were surveyed, basically asking how their views of a color were perceived to be masculine or feminine. The chart on the right, by the way, was in the experiment, but was more used as an introduction and it wasn't like actual replication of the data from the experiment. So back to the experiment. The survey asked if they would choose products of a certain color. The findings was that male products like cologne and aftershave were more preference to be darker tones, while predominantly feminine products were preference to be lighter and brighter tones of color. The correlation value of the experiments was very high with a p-value of over 0.05, which demonstrated a correlation between consumers preferencing masculinity of product colors with their behavior or with their purchasing power of the products, and vice versa, female products with feminine colors. Once again, this experiment is valuable in light of how color influences consumers and different products. So very similar to masculinity and femininity. Our seventh experiment that we chose to look at and we chose to talk about focused on gender. It had 50 girls and 50 guys. This online survey was selected because it directly relates to the previous study. A predetermination of color exists based on gender alone. It isn't a study that directly ties into our initial experiment, but in its research demonstrated that there is a direct correlation between gender and color preference. This is valuable for application to um, our our key ideas and what we want to know about consumers' decision making with colors. And you can see on the chart, like, so it's and that in those two circles, it's showing what favorite color is for men and women, and you can obviously see what the application would be in a packaging field. That men are more susceptible to greens than women would be, or women are more susceptible to purples than men are. So we felt that it was valuable to include this in our studies. So we chose those seven. We obviously we had a lot more, but we chose those ones because we felt like they fit the most in line with what we were trying to look at. But the question now is, what does all this mean, and how does all this, with all these different research experiments and topics, fit into our initial hypothesis? Well, our initial hypothesis, or our conclusion, was the packaging of the product, especially with the color, is effective in creating attractiveness and a mental picture for the consumer. It has a significant impact on the behavior of consumers in the marketplace. With color specifically on packaging, brightness and saturations have critical roles in affecting the consumer. There is no denying the effects of how color can manipulate the mind of the consumer. However, in accordance with time factors, emotions, brand recognition, gender, and many other factors, the degree of manipulation can vary greatly. So, what does this mean for our initial hypothesis? It means we fail to reject our hypothesis that color affects consumers' behavior in purchasing goods. Color affects consumers, but it is also influenced by other factors. Thank you. We're excited. So, yeah, signing off.